welcome everybody to the last Critical Antiquities Workshop for the first half of 2022, or the Southern Semester 1. Of course, we have a program that will be announced in due course for Semester 2 or second half of the year. But I would like to begin first by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which the University of Sydney, at least where I'm based, is located, and that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to recognise that it was a country that it was stolen and never ceded, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And it is with great pleasure that we are able to welcome Demetra Kasimis. Demi is a professor at the University of Chicago in political science, teaches and writes about democracy and its dilemmas in ancient and contemporary contexts. She's very interested in what makes a productive engagement with antiquity, very appropriate for our workshop, and specialises in problems of migration and political membership, gender and kinship, democratic instability and conspiracy, and interpretive method. Demi has authored a superb book, The Perpetual Immigrant and the Limits of Athenian Democracy, which I heartily recommend, published in 2018 with Cambridge University Press. And it is wonderful that she can offer her thoughts today on the subject of the not so hidden problem of private wives, what gender has to do with stasis in Aristotle. Thank you very much, Demi.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Tristan, for the invitation. I'm honored to be part of the network. And as I was saying before we started recording, this is just such a great service you do to the profession, bringing us together like this. And I'm really excited to share this work. So as I'll suggest really more in the beginning of my talk, but I'd be happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. This talk is drawn from a chapter on Aristotle that's part of a larger project that I've been working on for a couple of years. There are some people here like Emma who's engaged with it already. And so maybe toward the end of our discussion, I can sort of link it to the other pieces of the project if there's time, but I'll just get started. So what does gender have to do with stasis? And for Aristotle in particular? To help answer this question, we need to turn back to Plato, to the Republic, to Book 8, to the moment we find out that political decay is inevitable. After books and books of planning and plotting, Socrates reveals that the Kallipolis will actually fall apart because destruction, he says, awaits everything that has come to be. This admission that real-world regimes are not statically fixed forms appears straightforward enough, but how the dialogue imparts this insight is anything but straightforward. He calls on muses in these passages, as Homer would, he says, to explain how regimes alter and collapse. But the muses supply him with much more than a general claim about the inherent flux of political life. The Kallipolis degenerates, they tell us, because rulers eventually fail to regulate sexual desire and intercourse among the guardian class. In the end, it is Eros that disorders the just city. Its guardians procreate at variance with the secret rules designed by the founders to regulate the making of political kin. Stephen Halliwell has written that a narrator who invokes a muse already knows what matters most, humanly and divinely, about the proposed subject. And the proposed subject of the Republic's 8th book is real-world polities. What matters most for understanding them is apparently what tragic, divinely inspired tales like the Iliad always concern. For Halliwell, this is violence, destruction, and decay. And yet we miss something crucial that neither Plato nor Homer does when we restrict ourselves to Halliwell's list of themes. The explicit cause for the epic violence Homer recounts, after all, is a woman. More accurately, it is the movement that this woman, Helen, in a state of Eros, undertakes from her conjugal oikos to the foreign one of a man who was not her husband. So when it comes to collective life, what seems to matter just as much, if not before, violence, destruction, and decay, is the exchange in women that makes and unmakes political kin, that establishes and undoes an oikos, and provides for and breaks down the political order of a city. Plato's Republic identifies this movement as the fulcrum of stasis. What if Aristotle does too? But before I get into that, another minute on Plato seems necessary here, because the covert practices for regulating reproduction in the Callipolis, what critics have long called a marriage lottery, misleadingly, since it's actually a strategy for eradicating the conjugal oikos. The oikos, that classical Greek conduit for transmitting and acquiring private property and citizenship. Susan Oken writes that there can be no conception of the oikos apart from the polis and the Callipolis, because what she calls the nuclear family constitutes one of those institutional arrangements which foster the ascendance of particularism and factionalism. In other words, Socrates eliminates the imperative to forge kinship networks and political alliances through marriage, because the conjugal oikos is a source of rival political allegiance, instability, and stasis. Just as other forms of private property were seen as destructive of society's unity, Oken says, so the concept of private wives is viewed by Plato as divisive and subversive in the same way. The Republic takes on patriarchy because the subordination of women in and through marriage is the Greek strategy for transmitting wealth and membership, and as we will see, enabling or disabling democratic equality between men. To be a citizen, to belong to the polis, in the words of Ellen Meikson's Wood, was precisely not to belong to an oikos other than one's own. But with these introductory remarks on the Republic, I want to shift the focus from where it usually falls in discussions of stasis in classical Greek thought, away from a singular concern with ambition, avarice, and class struggle, or the public acts of public men, to a spotlight on patriarchy and the family form. One can easily see a link between stasis and the exchange in women and other supposedly private matters in Attic drama, the histories of Herodotus, and Homeric epic. And the link clearly surfaces there because these texts discuss monarchies and dynasties, regimes which do not distinguish between what we might today call the public and private realms. The domestic actions of women matter politically there, supposedly, because questions of the oikos have not yet been distinguished from questions of political rule. I'm going to suggest instead, and this is part of the aim of the bigger project, that what happens behind closed doors does not disappear in the classical period or from classical Greek thought, but takes new and underappreciated shape in the figuration of oligarchic plots, marriage alliances gone awry, and illicit sex. Athenian prose writers in particular explore these activities not only for the ways that they pose distinct political, economic, and symbolic problems for the stability of a democracy, but also for the ways a democracy's efforts to use patriarchy to stabilize itself in the face of internal threats from the wealthy, or from, I'll get into this, from other citizens, generates new sources of internal conflict and instability. Sources, in other words, that can, by virtue of their relation to the oikos and the underseen or the hidden, get troped in conspiratorial terms. So now to Aristotle. Patriarchy and the family form runs through the most thorough treatment of stasis of any author of the classical period, and that's Politics. The account of political change and revolution, developed at length in Book 5, maintains that stasis generally grows out of economic disparity and class conflict. Among the many historical examples Aristotle marshals to illustrate this claim are conflicts involving marriages, the transmission of women's property, and dowries. These small-scale disagreements induce Stasis because they concern matters of what he calls great importance, and I'll get into this passage in more detail in a couple of minutes. The criticism on the politics has tended not to examine these exemplary cases in depth or to analyze their allusions to gender, women, and kinship. Now, on the one hand, the preference for seeing in the politics a materialist analysis of conflict that would fail to register the oikos as a dynamic and publicly regulated institution that can sustain or undo a polity's order is perplexing, because the politics is perhaps best known for a theory of politics that begins with an account of the oikos. On the other hand, readers frequently cast these opening lines as a foundational site for naturalizing women's subordination to men and establishing a hierarchical divide between the private and the public that continues into modernity. No passage in Greek or Roman literature has exerted a more powerful influence on subsequent justifications of patriarchy, claims Edith Hall, than the section on the limited deliberative faculty of women, which justifies their domination by men in the oikos. Now, whether this limitation is for Aristotle the effect of an internal attribute or the result of a lived experience of political exclusion is unclear from the text and the subject of longstanding scholarly disagreement. But whatever its justification, women's subordination appears necessary to the everyday functioning of the conventional Greek oikos, which the politics is wedded to upholding. Right? Aristotle famously objects to the Republic's abolition of marriage, the conjugal family form, and private property. As Oken writes of the politics, women are private wives with domestic functions, and there is no more to be said on the subject. As I hope to show by the end of the talk, if we look outside of Book 1, we find that in the discussions of property, inequality, and stasis, that there is much more to be said about the exchange in women, and that Aristotle takes so-called private wives and their domestic roles not as givens, but as questions of social and economic power. The poor and the rich are commonly said to constitute two separate cities at war in ancient Greece. I read the politics to suggest that this ever-present conflict over economic inequality is impossible to understand without accounting for patriarchal power in both oligarchies and democracies. This is the reason the politics begins with the oikos, its internal hierarchies, and its relation to the polis. And as my reading attempts to show, it's also the reason that the legislation and regulation of marriage, the reproduction of heirs, domestic labor, slavery, and the intergenerational transmission of property and membership, all of which belong to the oikos, constitute a dimension of Aristotle's analysis of real-world regimes. If the patriarchal kinship practices Aristotle takes to be necessary to the oikos can, like any set of practices, adapt to and enable the interests of the wealthy in oligarchies, they can also be used to restrain or embolden oligarchic power in democracies like Athens, where the regulation of women's ability to inherit property and move into and through public spaces is even more curtailed. The politics gives voice to the view widely shared in other texts of the classical period that the gender-structured family is a potential terrain for class struggle, and for this reason, a hidden terrain of democratic power. So now I'm going to look more closely at Book 5. In the earliest surviving political writings of the Archaic Age, stasis generally connotes, according to Andrew Lintott, not necessarily violent civil conflicts, but contests for power, which are irreducible to mere differences of political opinion. Aristotle's treatment of the subject exhibits a similar range. He occasionally refers to stasis as a form of violent division, signifying political instability or the onset of deep changes in a regime. Some of these metaboli are what we might translate as a revolution, as one oligarchy becomes democracy or vice versa. Others are coups within an existing monarchy or oligarchy when power changes hands from one person or a group to another. There are also variations, as when regimes, including democracies, become more or less extreme versions of themselves, and changes to part of a constitution are planned or achieved. Now, running through Aristotle's wide-ranging account of stasis is his insistence that divisions within the citizen body into interest-based factions of rich and poor are, as Josiah Ober puts it, the socio-political condition that induces corruption in real-world Greek democracies and oligarchies. So Aristotle links stasis to the differing perceptions of injustice among rich and poor citizens, Ober says, which for Aristotle generate feelings of dishonor and stoke desires for change. In the politics, understanding and preventing civic violence, revolution, and regime collapse therefore requires a thoroughgoing examination of the nomoi governing the economic relations in existing polities in the Greek world. Now, this interplay in Aristotle's thought that he analyzes all metaboli, all changes to political systems, not only those which arise from violence or peaceful revolutions, by tracking the material bases of power needs highlighting. It is the reason Aristotle thinks oligarchic and tyrannical tendencies can flourish within a democracy before or in spite of any formal regime change. His materialist analysis of the bases of power and the reasons for stasis, however, includes attention to gender relations and the oikos as a mutable institution. This dimension of the politics comes to the fore in Book 5, as I mentioned, where Aristotle explicitly ties stasis to marriage and inheritance disputes. Okay, so at 1304, he claims that stases sometimes take hold not over, but from small matters. The distinction is worth stressing, it seems, because these stases are nevertheless carried out over great things, perimegalon. The point is difficult to parse, and Aristotle draws on several examples from different parts of Greece to illustrate its meaning. In one, a groom decides not to follow through on marrying his bride, and her insulted father, one of the brokers of the interrupted alliance, finds his would-be son-in-law praying inside the sacred space of a temple and murders him, as if to avenge one transgression of ritual with another. The city descends into violence as people take sides for or against the bride's family, and the regime at Delphi falls. In another case, two women inherit their father's wealth. A man intent on marrying his son to one of the daughters is blocked and stirs up stasis. Similar quarrels, says Aristotle, are responsible in one case for a conspiracy to overthrow the government and in another for all-out war. Now, the story of the jilted bride and her murdering parents, like their companion stories, have not provoked much analysis by critics. Engagements with the passages are generally brief, and with few exceptions, they focus on the historical veracity of the anecdotes rather than on their possible theoretical meanings. So Stephen Scoltetti surmises that Aristotle includes the quote unquote nasty and violent examples because he says they all involve people who are politically consequential, authorities, leaders, the powerful, and notables. Just as in monarchic and dynastic regimes where marriage involves succession, so here presumably marriage becomes a political issue because it involves the ruling class. Arlene Saxonhouse argues that the story's instant private vendettas and love affairs gone awry, conflicts of the most personal sort that sparked the overthrow of regimes. Their political significance has less to do then with the status of those involved and more to do with what they represent to the city's inhabitants. She writes, a love affair gone awry alone would not cause a regime to change, but it does so because such a controversy taps into the deepest resentments deriving from the uncertain criteria that determine who partakes of the honors and the power in the city. Minor offenses and insults chip away at the fragile life of a city. Now, this conclusion gestures to the contingency of the political situations, right? The cities were already, in Saxonhouse's view, stewing in conditions of stasis, and the apparently precarious means through which power is acquired. But if marriage relates to the acquisition of power, is its interruption really just a minor offense? Matthew Simonton goes further to develop an analysis of this section of the politics by building on the rarely noted fact that all the examples concern historically oligarchic regimes. He says that Aristotle recognized that oligarchies were especially endangered by private quarrels. In each case, he describes, an oligarchy ultimately collapses following private disputes arising between members of the ruling group. Now, for Simonton, Book 5 illuminates, or these examples in Book 5 illuminate a familiar dimension of Aristotle's argument about political instability and revolution. Oligarchies are less stable than democracies because they are plagued by an additional source of tension, conflict within the ruling class. Disagreements among the elite members of an oligarchy, he writes, can induce a breakdown of the political order and a constitutional revolution when one side in the struggle mobilizes the support of the disempowered masses, who in return may call for a change in regime. Now, this reading rightly identifies infighting among the ruling class as a source of regime collapse and new founding, and it enables us to see the politics echoing the cause for regime change that was provided by the Muses in Book 8 of the Republic. But what exactly the members of the ruling class are fighting over here remains unclear and appears unimportant on this account. In stressing the causal mechanism of elite infighting, the oligarchic reading elides the specificity of the conflicts. What are they about? And neglects to consider how they might expand our understanding of Aristotle's arguments about oligarchy rather than simply affirm what we already take them to be. But to consider that, we need first to address the interpretive tendency to call the exemplary cases in Book 5 private or personal. One problem with calling the conflicts personal, or private or personal, is that it implicitly imputes to Aristotle the view that questions of power are questions of rule. To understand Aristotle's claim that stasis breaks out, perimegalon, over great things, in other words, as a statement about the great men who engage in stasis, is to shift attention from the relations that are figured by the examples, which include erotic ones and relations between men and women, or what Book 1 of the Politics tells us. Patriarchy sustains the oikos, which sustains the political and economic order of a regime. How men rule over or with each other over the polis is also a question of how men rule over women. Now, what unites the exemplary cases of stasis in this section of the politics is not their personal nature, but the exchange in women, the singular political practice that I mentioned at the start, of course, and everybody here, I'm sure, knows well, is for establishing the oikos. In suggesting that we see marriage as the thread running through the case studies, I am not denying the intimate relations of sex that are implied here, right, by marriage alliances or the affairs that threaten them. Many of the activities belonging to the oikos take place behind closed doors and are brought into public life by the kurios, or guardian of the oikos, who represents the interests of his estate to the demos. But I'm trying to draw attention to the public stakes of the conjugal oikos, right? The politically and legally defined reproductive institution through which property and slaves were moved, kin were produced, and membership was inherited first and foremost because women were exchanged in marriage. As we'll see in a minute, Greek cities had different laws for dowries and property ownership, but the real world regimes that inform Aristotle's investigation here all seem to have ensured that a conjugal family form provided for property. This means that the question of regime type and its maintenance over time, which the oligarchy reading of Book 5 foregrounds, is insufficiently understood outside of a gender analysis. It also means that oligarchy can be used to analyze democracy. To understand what constitutes the great things over which stasis breaks out in Book 5, we need to go back to the more fundamental question I posed at the start. What does gender have to do with stasis? And here I think it's helpful to consider the broad lines of Nicola Rowe's argument in The Divided City, which is a landmark study of stasis. It's unique for attending to women and the family form. Leroux argues that in the wake of the post-oligarchic amnesty of 403, Athenians, this is her word, translation, repressed stasis by denying long-standing, if not permanent, political divisions between oligarchs and democrats, and promoted the originary kinship of Athenian citizens as a kind of naturalizing and unifying emollient. This mythical autochthonous ideal cast Athenian citizens as a fraternal brotherhood with different individual fathers and one common mother, the earth. The mythical claim that human women were somehow biologically irrelevant to biological or political kinship conflicted with the realities of Athenian law, of course, which required, after 451, dual Athenian parentage for citizenship. But in the 4th century, in which Plato and Aristotle wrote, says Leroux, Athenian public and political discourse reimagined the bulwark against stasis as a united city of autochthonous men. So in this way, Athenians made the stability of democracy dependent on the division of the sexes. The fantasy of unity, in other words, came at a cost. Keeping stasis at bay meant obscuring the legal and political role of citizen women, the material practices that establish the oikos and create political kinship. Now, most important for the purposes of my argument is Leroux's claim here that the reassertion of autochthonous lineage appropriated the family, the city's basic unit, as the very metaphor of the polis. And because although Leroux does not go so far as to say it, her argument suggests that by denying the realities of biological reproduction and kinship, Athenian discourse emptied the Athenian family form of its political and legal function so that it could serve as an allegory for the polis, which was now thoroughly equated to an androcentric demos. Now, the divided city might be understood as part of a broader movement in classical studies to make sense of why the oikos appears to have become a focal point of 4th century Athenian thought and politics. Sarah Pomeroy notes a subtle shift, these are her words, from the communal concerns voiced in 5th century Athenian drama and public addresses, such as Pericles' funeral oration, to the squabbles, financial problems, and self-interested experiences of 4th century inscriptions and private orations. The shift is subtle because in the 5th century, the oikos is the preeminent theme of Attic drama, albeit in the form of mythical ruling families. But in the 4th, the oikos appears in court cases in reference to the households of real Athenian people. Ultimately, says Pomeroy, it is unclear whether the shift reflects the historical sources we have for the Athenian family, which differ vastly from the 5th to the 4th century, or whether these sources are reflecting what she calls actual social change in Athens after the Peloponnesian War. Leroux's argument offers a potential analysis of this shift. The focus on the oikos in public and political discourse is a way for Athenian critics to displace stasis. Once domesticated, stasis can only ever indirectly affect the demos. Now, without discounting this argument that the oikos serves as a topos for repressing economic and political divisions that are too explosive to address in formally or explicitly political terms after the amnesty in 403, we might see this framework as nevertheless coming at a kind of interpretive and theoretical cost. Because from Leroux's position, it becomes difficult to see how broadly and creatively classical Greek texts continue to explore the seemingly hidden workings of power in the oikos as questions of material relations, or to question the political effects of that hiddenness. Leroux's focus on the allegorizing function performed by the oikos may explain the prevalence of familial metaphors for the polis, but it cannot account for and may even divert attention from the political and public function of the oikos. So I've been suggesting that this function constitutes an important but persistently overlooked dimension of Aristotle's analysis in the Politics, which is a text that Leroux doesn't discuss in the Divided City. But what I want to stress is that in the politics, the oikos surfaces literally and not metaphorically as a political concern. And it's that literalizing, reliteralizing of the oikos I want to do, because I think it then helps me mobilize these more figurative treatments of the activities of the oikos that get troped in conspiratorial terms. So it's this kind of taking the oikos and material relations more seriously that then allows me to sort of open up this whole discourse of conspiracy in the book, which I can make clear a little later. Now, to illustrate how the exemplary cases of Stasis do this work in the politics, I want to turn now to some discussions of women and property that are elsewhere in the work. So book 2 offers this extended critique of Spartan women that doubles, in the words of Paul Cartledge, as a critique of the Spartan property regime as a whole. Aristotle notes there that there's this unequal distribution of private landed property in Sparta, and he goes on to lament that 2/5 of the land are under women's control. The passage, as Stephen Hodkinson has noted, has long served as the main piece of evidence for generations of historians to claim that women in classical and Hellenistic Sparta exerted an unusual amount of control over property, especially by comparison with Athenian women. But the meaning of Aristotle's critique of women's ownership is hardly clear here. Hodkinson concludes that Aristotle's concern with what he glosses as the public impact of female domestic influence is that women pressurize their menfolk to acquire wealth, and that female possession of wealth gives them a hold over their men and some control over public affairs as the powers behind the ostensible rulers. Perhaps, that book 1 of the Politics suggests that Aristotle takes pains to delineate the proper relations of authority within the oikos. So to assume that he's primarily concerned with disparaging female dominance over the ostensible male rulers in the Spartan account, rather than with assessing how this relation generates and may be generated by a particularly precarious polity, risks missing Aristotle's interest in assessing the household as a dynamic political institution. So consider, for example, a passage in the Ethics where Aristotle says that oiko can resemble political systems and even serve as models for them. Sometimes he says women rule because they are heiresses, and in these cases, he adds, their rule is not in accordance with virtue, but due to wealth and power, as in oligarchies. Although the comment might be voicing a chauvinist lament about unnaturalness, it is also, if not more transparently read, as an observation about property relations. Aristotle offers 3 reasons that ownership of real property becomes concentrated in a few hands in Sparta. The laws do not prevent the gift or bequest of land. There are many women with inheritances who could be married off at the discretion of their guardians, and dowries are large. The result is the collapse of Sparta's political order. So here's Aristotle. It would surely have been better to have given no dowries at all, or if any, but small or moderate ones. As the law now stands, a man may bestow his heiress on anyone whom he pleases, and if he dies intestate, the privilege of giving her away descends to his heir. Hence, although the country is able to maintain 1,500 cavalry and 30,000 hoplites, the whole number of Spartan citizens fell below 1,000. The result proves the faulty nature of their laws respecting property, for the city sank under a single defeat. The want of men was their ruin. So as Hodkinson explains this conclusion, the growing concentration of property and consequent impoverishment of ordinary citizen households made it impossible for Spartan men to pay monthly dues to their common mess groups. Inability to pay meant a loss of citizenship because citizenship required membership. In this way, the lack of limits on dowries led to a concentration of wealth and to a shortage of citizens. Now, Lynn Foxhall has carefully shown that in classical Athens, and other Greek cities, the most important means of acquiring wealth and property was the transfer of property from one generation to the next via the linked institutions of inheritance and dowry. That's a quotation from her. Now, while strategies for property transmission differed from city to city and regime to regime, many of the general principles and social structures were similar across the Greek world and over time, she says. The main evidence for these widespread Greek practices are Athenian speeches from the law courts of the 4th century. But building on these speeches and other kinds of textual materials, Foxhall calls into question the presumption that Athenian women could not own property, and specifically that they could not own land. Her claims are important not only for an understanding of property in democratic Athens, but also for a reading of women and the family form in the politics, a reading that can expand what we see as the hidden sites of democratic power and erosion. So if in Athenian or in discussions of Athenian political economy, women are generally overlooked and gender rarely adopted as an analytic frame, that may have something to do with the anachronistic view of property scholars typically apply to classical Greece. So Foxhall argues that criticism tends to equate ownership to the right to dispose of property, when even land in Athens was inalienable. The inalienability of a dowry, Foxhall argues, does not mean the dowry is not owned. Dowries came with women when they moved from their natal oiko to their conjugal oikoi, and went back with them when they divorced. Dowries thus constituted women's patrimonial inheritance, received at marriage and in this sense equivalent to men's. Although they tended to entail movable goods and cash, dowries were not, by definition, non-landed property in Athens. A kyrios acted publicly on behalf of the oikos, says Foxhall, but the household operated as a single economic unit and used the dowry corporately. While it's unclear whether men counted dowries as part of their assets, the loss of its capital value or any income it produced would have had severe effects on a kyrios's livelihood and by extension that of the entire oikos. This is one reason that, as Hodkinson suggested, Greek texts associate a large dowry with a woman's influence and rule over the household. But importantly for Foxhall, historical evidence suggests that women's individual ownership is not non-existent in classical Greece, but rather concealed by household use on the one hand and the public meaning of gender on the other. Now, I think it's difficult to overstate the importance of this last claim of hers for an understanding of stasis and regime breakdown. Women's ownership, their role in possessing while more or less possessed themselves, is obscured by traditional readings of dowries, marriage, the oikos, and the exclusion of citizen women from the deliberative spaces of the polis. And scholars become somewhat complicit in concealing the economic role of women when they read strictly in terms of what was said and done by the demos, conflate the kyrios with the oikos for which he spoke, and elide the economic and political relations of marriage. For as Foxhall states, the dowry was regarded as the woman's material contribution to the establishment of the new household and is one among many reasons that she played a substantial role in its economic life. So to treat gender as a category of historical analysis, as Foxhall does here, is, I think, to rethink the basic terms in which economic relations in classical Greece are analyzed and the hiddenness of the oikos understood. The shift in perspective lends support to the claim that I've been making that the exemplary cases of stasis, the great things over which stasis breaks out in the politics, concern the set of political and economic relations that are signified by women and the family form and which have a long history of legislation and political analysis in classical Greece. If the proper circulation of women in marriage establishes alliances between two kin networks to produce the conjugal oikos and its attendant kinship assignments, the mishandling of a marriage alliance, as noted repeatedly in Book 5, represents a distortion in the regulation of kinship, the manipulations of marriage and descent, to borrow Gail Rubin's formulation, that generate the entire social and political structure and underlie its economy. So this suggests that the threat posed by a failed or interrupted marriage does not matter only in the cases of elite families or dynastic forms of rule. Aristotle's treatment of the practices of marriage and inheritance that enable dynastic wealth makes the bigger point, the generalizable point, that pertains to all cities in which marriage and the subordination of women are used to sustain or prevent a set of political and economic relations. So in order to kind of make this connection between what he says about oligarchy to a democratic context, I wanted to turn briefly to another theorist of the polis, Engels. In The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels argues that the subjection of women in modern capitalist society is primarily precipitated by economic forces. But the modern bourgeois family is only the latest manifestation of this dynamic. Women's oppression can be traced back to the rise of monogamy and the patriarchal family in antiquity. We are confronted with this new form of family in all its severity among the Greeks, Engels writes. In Homer, the young female captives are exchanged as the objects of the sensual lust of the victors. Later, in the classical period of Aeschylus, the wedded wife, Engels writes, is expected to tolerate all of this, but to maintain strict chastity and conjugal fidelity herself. Engels concludes that the married woman of classical Greece is, quote, merely the mother of legitimate heirs, her husband's chief housekeeper, and the superintendent of the female slaves. Marriage and the ban on women's promiscuity, what he calls a matter of convenience arranged by the parents, work together to empower men to pass on their property to their offspring. So the argument for which Engels makes the polis a jumping off point is, while of course it's been criticized, it's also, I think, striking for how well it elaborates on dynamics that the politics puts into view but does not fully articulate. Especially helpful is the claim made earlier by Marx in the German ideology that the first-class antagonism to appear in history coincides with the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriage. In the history of class struggle in antiquity, de Sainte-Croix elaborates on the point. Greek wives, if not Greek women in general, he argues, should be regarded as a distinct economic class, since their productive role led directly to their being subjected to men politically, economically, and socially. Now, whether we choose to adopt the analytic category of class here, it's useful for de Sainte-Croix for highlighting the restrictions that made women's economic and legal position in classical Athens different from men's, and therefore essential for an analysis of Athenian political economy. And most crucial here is his observation that women's economic subordination serves to ameliorate the antagonism between mass and elite in Athenian democracy. But as I develop in a sort of later part of the project, this also establishes a new democratic site of antagonism. The regulation of women's property is a democratic strategy for blocking the monopolistic control of property by the ruling class for him. But as I'll say more toward the end of my talk, which is in a couple of minutes, it produces new forms of uncertainty and instability that have to do with women and their power. So here's de Sainte-Croix, I'm just going to quote for a second. Where women are largely deprived of property rights, one good result may follow. If property is fairly widely distributed in the first place, and if, as in all or nearly all Greek states, marriage is patrilocal, so that the girl leaves her father's clan and family, and taking with her whatever she possesses, either as dowry or in her own right, goes to join her husband's family, then to keep women propertyless may well help to prevent property from accumulating rapidly in the hands of the richer families. Now, this reading of the polis resists equating the oikos to family and resists assuming it is natural or pre-political. The oikos emerges on his account as a predicate and effect of the polis, Patriarchy, or the democratic subordination of women, serves a specific set of class dynamics in Athens, with marriage as its fulcrum. The predominance of private property over common property and the interest in inheritance as Engels writes made marriage, quote, more than ever dependent on economic considerations. And so Juliet Mitchell's suggestion that the more interesting question to take from Marx and Engels may not be the origin of the oppression of women, but its maintenance, is a useful reminder to treat the oikos as a dynamic institution that changes shape in response to democratic concerns about economic inequality. That the practices of women's exchange and property holding can impede accumulation by the rich in Athens is possible because family law ensures that property, wealth, and membership circulates intergenerationally. So here I want to just take a couple of minutes to share the argument that Susan Leip has importantly made on this topic, more or less, that before Athenian democracy took its familiar shape, Solon's democratizing legal reforms established the conjugal family as what she calls the sole legitimate family form and the site for the transmission of property in order to weaken the power of aristocratic families. Often recounted by scholars is that these laws laid the foundations for democracy by divorcing political power from aristocratic citizenship and abolishing debt bondage for citizens. What is less often highlighted in the story, Leip says, is that as part of these political reforms, Solon implemented a broad package of laws that included provisions for legitimacy and heirship. These reforms attached privileges to legitimacy and disabilities to bastardy, with the effect of putting, quote, every man on the same reproductive footing, unquote. Solon's institution of a standardized intergenerational family form was essential for the establishment and maintenance of democracy over time because it created the material conditions for what Leip calls a belief in male egalitarianism. So by making it impossible for children born outside of the conjugal family to count as heirs, the reforms placed limits on the ways in which women and female reproductive capacity could be used to generate male power and prestige. In subsequent years, Athenians tried to reform the use of dowries for similar reasons, though the only known legislation to eliminate and restrict them, according to Demosthenes, appears to have been unsuccessful. So in throwing light on how legal regulations on kinship practices and the control of women serve democratizing aims, Leip helps bring out the crucial political role that the gender-structured oikos plays in mediating economic tensions between rich and poor in Athens, and suggests, as I've already mentioned, that readers have been sort of complicit in depoliticizing the Solonian reforms that concern the family, that concern the oikos. It's striking then that ultimately Leip traces what she calls this modern liberal tendency back to a separate spheres ideology that originates with Aristotle, who, in her words, considers the conjugal family to be natural and therefore prior to the political arena. So, of course, I've been suggesting that putting Aristotle in the service of this distinction, this modern separate spheres idea, depends on neglecting parts of his argument where the oikos functions as a historically specific and mutable institution, parts that can be read to argue for the opposite of the separate spheres view. There is, after all, no reason to conclude that the gendered character of Aristotle's small matters is incidental to the politics interest in oligarchy or democracy. So once the conjugal family acquires this new status in Athens as a legally sanctioned reproductive institution, the oikos becomes the condition for male citizen equality under democracy. And this is one reason that the proper circulation of women that I started with in the Republic, and then we see in the politics, gets figured as the fulcrum of stasis in Athenian political thought. After all, Athenian law did not simply block wealthy men from consolidating power, it predicated democratic equality, the power of poor men over rich, on the economic and reproductive control of women. So if this is right, then the threat to democracy does not come exclusively from men or wealthy men. It also comes from women, from the inside, from the oikos. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Demi. That was very thought-provoking and extremely interesting and theoretically sophisticated. So thank you. I have a burgeoning question, but before I jump in, I'll let everyone know what our kind of protocol is for questioning. So if you have a question, it would be best if you could type the letter Q in the chat function, and that way I can keep an eye on the order of the questions. And you're also welcome to type the question if you like in the chat function, and then I can read it for you if you'd prefer that. I want to quickly jump in and ask my question before I hand it over to Bob. So something I find in my own work is that I want to use Aristotle in kind of two ways, which can only be faintly distinguished. One is as a very rich theorist of political affairs and social phenomena. And the other is as a witness to social phenomena and political affairs. And I kind of want to maintain a view to both of those aspects, because sometimes I like to read the phenomena that Aristotle is a witness to against the way that he's interpreting it. And yet there's only so far sometimes that we can take that because, you know, he's selecting certain things to bolster his argument, and it's very much, you know, yeah, he provides a thick lens through which we can see these things. Just sometimes it's harder than we might wish. But I wondered, with respect to the work you're doing here, where would you situate the use you're making of Aristotle's analysis of the oikos and these private wives here? Is it a little bit more that you're interested in what he's witnessing and testifying to as a, you know, 4th century Greek man, or is it a little bit more that you're trying to look at the way he's theorizing these things and theorizing them within the context of stasis? And I'm kind of guessing that it's going to be both, but I guess I'm interested to see which one is it. Where would you situate yourself more in terms of what you're doing with Aristotle here? And I hope that's an okay framework for thinking about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, my answer is both, but I guess the passages that I look at they've never seemed, and I think this is why they're underread by non-historians, is that they do just sort of read as historical evidence. They don't really, so more in the witness side of things. And that if I were going to draw out more of the theoretical Aristotle, I'd want to go back to book 1 and really kind of and think about how what he's doing there between the oikos and the polis relates back to these moments in book 2 and book 5. That, I mean, the book 2 material in Sparta is kind of dry, but it also is, it's really hard to know if he's right. So you can't read it as historical evidence. I wonder what's at stake for you in making the distinction, because I think it's really hard to do. But I just think that the passages I'm looking at are hard to do a lot with, unless you're reading them alongside some of the richer moments.
Yeah.
And that's what took me to sort of Marxist historiography. And I got really interested in why or where the sort of feminist Marxist historiography might be in classics, and why there isn't maybe more interest in these passages. So I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, but I think it has to do partly with what I've been reading and not yet bringing into the discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, Bob Cowan.
Well, thank you so much. It was a wonderful paper, wonderfully clear, particularly to a non-Aristotelian like myself. I just wonder if I could try and maybe draw two strands of your paper together. I mean, to produce something possibly left field as a result. But I mean, the work you did with, I mean, both in your earlier work and today with 5th century tragedy, but also you were bringing Susan Lape's work in towards the end of the paper, and that just. I'd already been wondering about Menandrian comedy in the context of what you were discussing, and I wondered either as part of that 4th century zeitgeist, or perhaps more directly through a chain of influence directly, or through Theophrastus. I mean, are the ideas that you're discussing here reflected in the sort of the marriage plots and property and all the rest of it that Lape has obviously explored in this context with Menandrian comedy?
That's a great suggestion. I haven't thought to look there yet. I mean, actually have thought about it, but I haven't done it yet. So that's a great idea. And I should just say that the chapter that comes after this is a reading of Lysias 1, which is about adultery, right, or moikeia. And so it would be really useful to bring in dramatizations of marriage plots, because Lysias 1, my argument is that is plotted. That he implots it as a series of plots. There's the affair, which is a plot. There's the plot to kill the lover, right? So, but thank you. And then, right, it's an obvious another way to return to Susan's work. Thanks.
Ben.
Yeah, this is a really cool topic that you're working on. I think. More and more, I think about women and property. The more I think that there's a kind of huge sort of, if you like, dark matter of the Greek city sitting there that waits to be properly investigated. For example, I mean, how much is the city of Gorton preoccupied with the transmission of property through women? I mean, a very large proportion of that code is meticulous outline of how property and women are kind of intertwined. But my kind of question, I guess, or observation, was to come back to this rightly fascinating passage in Aristotle about the ruination of Sparta deriving from the property regime and the role of women in it. I mean, and it makes me think too that in your kind of critique or attempt to dismantle this notion that that women had no control over property, it kind of invites us to sort of really think about what that control consists of. So in one sense, the control of men over property is always a kind of use of that property, right? It's the deployment or the extraction of surplus from that property or whatever it might be. But women have a kind of more moral and symbolic attachment to it, don't they? So that you always see the verb echo entwined with women in relation to property. Think about the term in Sparta for the heiress is the patroiukos, the one who holds the patroa. She actually doesn't own it or use it, but she is so thoroughly entangled into it that her ownership is on a more profound and symbolic and moral level than anything that the world of men, can conceive. And so when we think about Sparta, you've got this world where men in the world of the Sycetion have completely banished property into this sort of dark matter of the oikos, where they just simply kind of engage in their sort of citizen reproduction through sort of pederastic cooptation and so on and so forth. And the world of women and the oikos is kind of kept out of sight and out of mind. But because that property is so important to sustaining membership of the Sycetion, then there is this kind of this sort of backdoor entanglement that starts to disrupt that kind of that imagined world of a men-only kind of sort of men-born society that Sparta seems to desire. So it's just fascinating the way that if we actually recalibrate our conception of ownership and control, then suddenly the control and ownership of women becomes seriously more profound at the symbolic level, I think. And by that I mean kind of ritual and ideological and, you know, what we see in tragedy as opposed to perhaps what we see in oratory. But anyway, it's extraordinarily thought-provoking and wonderful paper, so thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I wanted to ask you a question back though, because so the dark matter of the oikos, I mean, it's the conceit, right? Of the, I don't really think it's, my point is that, yeah, it isn't really, it is hidden, or women are, you know, of course, only women of means would sort of stay indoors, right? And can be surveyed and regulated that way. But that it is, I like this backdoor entanglement idea, because it is through the backdoor. It's always porous. I mean, and that's what, in a way, Aristotle is showing us. But I guess my question to you about the ownership point and the verbs that are used to describe women's relation to property, it makes me think that, I guess I wondered why you were using the term moral, and it made me wonder whether what we get with them is, if it's not use, it's possession, and you basically said that, and that it complicates our notions of possession to think about the ways that women are both kind of possessed and possessors. But what is the activity of possessing, right? What is it to kind of be a conduit or hold? And to think about that, also symbolically, but maybe I don't understand how it's moral. And I just thought you might want to say a little more about what you meant.
Oh, I guess I was entangling moral and symbolic in that, you know, I just think about the way that women speak in tragedy, for instance, that where there is a kind of a totalizing voice that they have. You know, the voice of Antigone is without doubt. You know, she has no doubt over her own moral conviction to be able to speak on behalf of this the world of, you know, of philia and the oikos and so on.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether there's this kind of symbolic power which in the eyes of Greek thought, to some extent, always dwarfs political power, right? Political power is always kind of to some extent tiny and diminished in relation to this kind of symbolic power. You know, I think about that passage in Demosthenes, where, you know, where the function of women at the funeral is not just simply to kind of prepare the dead and so on, but to upbraid the men for standing around and mourning when they should be out hunting down their brother's killer. You know, that kind of that sort of moral imperative that women have in relation to familial matters seems to be, you know, something that Greeks are often terrified of. And I'm just wondering about, you know, that entanglement with property as a sort of an extension of that.
Thanks.
But yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Elkie Nash.
Thank you so much. That was such a fascinating talk. And I'm going to apologize because I have a laptop and a monitor, and I'm going to look at the monitor so I can look at you while I speak, but I won't appear to be looking at you.
Okay, I was doing that.
Which is always very awkward. But I had a comment or two and a question, which is not very well formed, so I hope you'll bear with me. But the first comment was that as you were talking about kind of property and inheritance, I was thinking about a book which I bring up often, so apologies to those of you to whom I've mentioned it already, but Josina Block in her book on citizenship in classical Athens has a chapter, I think, on material and immaterial property and its inheritance, and in particular kind of along gender lines. I'll put it in the chat, and I wonder if that would be interesting for you in this work. Yes, I have another question, but in the interest of time, I might just email it to you and ask you my last ill-formed question. But as you know, as I think you touched upon or I suppose as you were talking, I was thinking about the way that Margaret Alexiou in the 70s kind of said sort of offhandedly in her book on ritual lament that democracy as a kind of political form sort of naturally subjugates women. And this is something that has always transfixed me. I've never known what to do with it. I don't necessarily believe that, and yet there's so much evidence that it's true. I suppose lately, as I've been thinking about democracy, I can't help but think of it as in conversation with the kind of democratic institutions in which we find ourselves right now. Yeah, sorry, all of these are just thoughts that are kind of ill-formed, but as you were talking, I was thinking in particular about the kind of emphasis now that we still find on the kind of nuclear family, the kind of hold on property which kind of capitalism demands. And in truth, I can never really find any way out of these kind of conundrums. But I suppose one thing that I was thinking, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on this, is that as we sort of think about Athens and about democracies and about kind of, the ways that they all work, I wonder if, and this is also wondering to myself, I wonder if it's worth emphasizing more sometimes the kind of way that Athenian democracy in particular really depended so heavily upon, in its daily structures and its kind of successful policies, et cetera, kind of really depended on an entire enslaved population. Which I find that I myself, and this is why I bring it up, don't maybe emphasize or problematize that enough. And then I wonder if in doing so, then in kind of bringing the past into conversation with the present, which may or may not be your interest, I wonder if then that kind of offers a more kind of capacious opening for imagining sort of possibilities, in our kind of current context. Yeah, so I think, again, not very well formed, certainly not in response to your wonderfully formed paper, but if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Well, no, thank you for the first for the reference, which I looked at the book, I think when it came out, when I wasn't working on this project, so I had no recollection of the chapter on inheritance, so that's really helpful. The Alexiou book, I mean, I'm going to look for this democracy as a political form that naturally subjugates women. I mean, I did get a rhetorical question at a conference about whether we should just get rid of democracy, if based on my reading or my argument. And it's a very difficult question how we should understand the relationship between democracy and patriarchy. And I kind of go around it here by saying that it's by focusing so much on its historical formation. And I think the fact that there are these examples, contemporary examples, of course, of the sexual and economic, the reproductive control of women in relation to democracy. What I'm trying to do, I am interested in contemporary questions, and I'm really want eventually with this to use the Athenian case, not only to kind of think in new ways about what classical Greek thinkers are doing with the entanglement of democracy and patriarchy here, but also to think in new ways about that relationship in the contemporary context. And so I don't yet have an answer for you, but I'm really grateful for the that you're prodding me to think more about what the relationship is that I am positing. Like, what is my argument about that relationship? So thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Amelia Brown.
Hi there. Thanks so much. I've really learned a lot from this paper, and I'm part of a reading group that's reading the Nicomachean Ethics and learning a lot on Friday afternoons. But I was wondering about the kind of relation with the evidence of Aristophanes' comedies, and how we can kind of bring those more into the discussion about the oikos and, what was sort of thought to be natural and unnatural by the Greeks in general related to the oikos and the relationship between men and women in it versus the Athenians specifically. Because I think it's very important for us to, try and prod the whole field of classics away from just seeing Athens as the, definer of what is typical of the oikos. Um, but
Mm.
but yet, that's our evidence, so it's
Right,
that's a problem.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
So Aristophanes fits into that, to your question.
Well, I
How?
guess because although he's obviously writing for an Athenian audience, he is promulgating a lot of stereotypes, right,
Right.
about the ways that the oikos is different and gender relations are different in other city-states. I wonder if we can bring that to bear with Aristotle, because Aristotle does seem, to be trying to theorize for a pan-Hellenic or even, pan-anthropic ethics
Mhm, mhm.
and politics. Yeah.
I think that's a great idea to bring Aristophanes in, because it's just more examples of how the oikos is this, it's a concept, it's an institution, and its meanings are being investigated and contested and differently practiced
Yeah.
by these
Yeah.
different groups. So I think
And
right.
differently, kind of assigned different kind of ethical qualities, or I mean, Ben was talking about moral qualities, but I don't know, I think I would say more sort of different ethical qualities for the city result from the proper relation between the woman and the man in the
Right.
oikos of it.
Right.
That's I think that's very much something. I mean, Aristophanes is very interested in generational conflict, right? I mean, that's pretty well established. But I think he's also very interested in gendered conflict too,
Yeah. Yeah.
and in the ways that can play out slightly differently in different cities, and there the certainly when we look further back too to the archaic era and bringing in like the Gortin law code, is very concerned in dowry and inheritance as well. So that, clearly dowry and inheritance and relations between men and women in dowry and inheritance questions were of central concern to polis across the Greek world, both democracies and oligarchies and, monarchies, right, as well. That was really prominent in both artistic and in legal, productions, let's say, or evidence that we have. So kind of all of that culminating in Aristotle, in both an Athenian and non-Athenian context, is what I'm kind of getting at. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
So, and I don't think we should think that democracy was any more patriarchal than any of the other city-state formations or political formations. That they were all patriarchal in different ways. Yeah.
No, and I think that is really helpful for helping me bring out how it's not some settled issue. What the relations between men and women. I mean, it's obvious insofar as it's the commonplace of dramatic poetry, right? But this specific issue of how women are, of the relationship to the oikos and women's property and their position within the estate and within managing the household, that's a live question. I think would be easier for me to make that point by looking at all of the other sort of examples from non-Athenian cases that are being.
That's
Thanks.
kind of a really active question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Andre Lax.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a very marginal question about Plato, if time allows. But my main question is about the expression that you used, talking about book one, about the depolitization of the oikos, I think you said.
Mm.
So I wanted to, I want to understand better what is at stake there. And so one question is, out of curiosity, is your book concerned, have you studied the case of the laws, of Plato's laws? Where oikos is prominent as the basic of the political system. And so, I would be interested to know what kind of relationship you are building between, on the one hand, what you called depolitization of the oikos in Aristotle, if I understood you rightly, and the politicization of economy. I borrow the expression politicization of economy from a work by Etienne Helmer, was written now extensively on the centrality of economics in Plato's laws, especially. And so that's part of the question. And the other part of the question is that it seems to me, but I'm uncertain about it, and please correct me if I am erring, but it seems to me that Aristotle's depolitization of the oikos in book one, the naturality that you pointed to and so on, is actually an answer to another kind of politicization of the oikos by Plato, which has nothing to do with economics, but which has to do with relations of power. And the analogy between the paterfamilias and the basileus and whatever. So, so that was the main question. And if I have time, I will add a small point on Plato's Republic.
Do you want to ask it, or because I?
Well, it's really another question.
Okay.
It has nothing to do with that.
I think that the depoliticization of the oikos was not me, but it was, I think that was where I was talking about the sort of common reading of the oikos. I was trying to actually show how he's not treating it. I mean, it's a pretty political institution in a way, in the sense that it precedes the polis conceptually, but.
Yeah, but I mean, there are two things here, because there is what you call the common reading of Aristotle's politics, and surely this common reading has something to do with what Aristotle does say, namely that the oikos precedes the polis and so on. What you are doing is that the things is more complicated, because Aristotle himself lends attention to the ekmikron, megalon, and so on. I have things to say about that also, but that would be too long. And so you might point to some kind of, not incoherence, but tension within Aristotle's theoretical statements about the priority, the ontological priority of oikos on politics on the one hand, and what it actually says about the functioning of the historical events. And okay, so that's what I wanted to point to, is that there is surely at the explicit theoretical statement of Aristotle the idea that the oikos is non-political. And so my question is really that this analysis is actually a reaction against Plato, not the Plato of the laws, which who does insist very much on the oikos as a building block of the political community for many reasons, including dowry and so on, and you know the inchangeability of the number of households and so on. So that's part of it. But the other part of it, and something that you have not really tackle the point, although it relates to with Ben's points about a cane and so on. The other point being that Aristotle's point, what Aristotle's links to politics is the exercise of power, of which oikos is a model. And so you try to link the two, of course, by bringing it economical power in, and that's a very interesting point of view or construction. But I mean, the situation is, I think, more complex than I retired from your wonderful talk, but you see what I mean. I try to complexify the relationship between politics, economy, power relationships, and I leave aside women because I think that. So that brings me to my Plato's question. Would you agree? So you started with Republic 8, right, and the decay of the city. And you brought in the muses, and you said you constructed an analogy between Plato and the fate of the city on the one hand, and the Homer and the erotic reasons that lay behind the Trojan War. Now, I think that it's a false analogy because, and it's a false analogy because yes, women are implied in the two cases, but not exactly in the same function, and actually in a very different function, because in Plato, the cause of the decay is not eros. Is an error, it's an intellectual error of calculation by the guardians about the time where people must be generating the offspring, right? So yes, women are implied in this, but it's not the erotic desire that disturbs that is the cause of the decline of the city. So this is marginal in some sense.
It's not, no, but it's not marginal. It's actually because I mean, if you want to place the emphasis on a failure of calculation, it's a failure to control, to regulate exactly what Aristotle is talking about, exactly what you find in Lysias, right? Which is eros, which is sexual desire and intercourse between men and women. Whether we think about that in terms of social reproduction or just desire, right? The point is that what is not being regulated is that in every instance. So you could, yes, it's being regulated well or badly. And that's true even not when you're outside of the Acropolis, right? When you're in Athens. Sex reproduction is still an object of regulation, of policing, of surveillance, of the law. So so I don't see how it's a false analogy, but I take your point, if I understood it correctly, that power relations are not reducible to economic relations, that there's more going on, right? And it's a great suggestion to look at the laws, which I will do as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
If we can steal a couple more minutes from you, Demi, Emma Bianchi has a question. Is that okay?
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, Demi, for this great paper. And, you know, I've been engaging with I've seen your manuscript, so I've had some time to think about some of these issues. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, you know, I mean, we're talking about that, you know, I really maybe to push you a little bit on how you really are understanding the relationship, the structural relationship between household and polis, you know, because you know, you mentioned Leip's emphasis on separate spheres, where you know, sometimes very much encouraged, I think, in some kind of a, you know, contemporary political theoretical and feminist theoretical engagements with antiquity, to think of, you know, one over here, one over here, sort of that there. And but, you know, for Aristotle, you know, I always think, you know, he's such a biological thinker that the household has always seemed to be like the cell within the organism. So if you think about that in this more kind of part whole relationship, you know, I mean, I suppose I just wanted to see whether you might, you know, that might help your analysis in some way, insofar as, you know, anything that goes on in a cell is likely to have consequences at the level of an organism. I mean, not that they had a kind of theory of cells in that antiquity, but, you know, this kind of part whole or maybe organological relationship between the two.
Yeah, I love that. I think you're right. I mean, I think that fits with, it sounds right to me, the part whole relationship, the cell within the organism. And it would be really fun and challenging for me to try to engage the biological writings and see if there's anything there. I mean, in your work, in Sarah's work, that I could draw on. Because yeah, good.
Parts of animals might be a good resource there, you know. Yeah.
Thank you.
I also commend to you Marguerite Delarier's newly published Sexual Difference in Aristotle Sexual Difference, which we're going to be launching next semester in the Critical Antiquities Workshop. So stay tuned for that. And that's a good segue for saying thanks so much, Demi, for this wonderful talk and engaging discussion. And we look forward to seeing people again next semester. Stay tuned for an email with a list of events and a flyer. And until then, hope you enjoy your northern summer, and we'll continue freezing with our unseasonably cold Sydney winter or Southern Hemisphere winter. But thanks again. Please join me in giving Demi a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was really fun and helpful.